Hello all, this is Dr. Lyons, and today we're going to be talking about the second group of invertebrates that we're going to cover in Chapter 7. So as I was saying before, Chapter 7 is split up into 4 parts. In the last part we talked about kind of some generals about invertebrates, such as what they are. In general, we talked about the sponges, and then in this part we're going to talk about 3 new groups that we haven't discussed yet. The Cnidarians, the Tenafores, and the Mollusks. And what you're seeing in this picture is a type of Cnidarian. This is what a particular species of coral in the Indo-Pacific looks like. And so we've already seen this this evolutionary tree before. Last time, like I was saying, we talked about the sponges, these guys over here. And what we're going to be getting into today is these 3 groups. So the Cnidarians, the Tenafores, and the mollusks. And we're kind of slowly working our way from the sponges all the way up to the chordates. That's what we'll be at the very end of Chapter 7. So something that we're going to kind of talk about is what coral and jellyfish have in common. So corals and jellyfish are both in this group, the phylum Cnidaria. And as a reminder, when you see words that have 2 consonants at the beginning that don't seem to fit, such as the C and N, typically the first letter is silent. So it's pronounced Cnidarian. So just cut out that C there. And so we're going to talk about what corals and jellyfish, which are both Cnidarians, we're going to talk a little bit about what they have in common. So for instance, something that they both have in common is radial symmetry. So we discussed how animals have either radial symmetry, bilateral symmetry, or have no symmetry, sometimes called irregular symmetry. So radial symmetry, that's when those animals have kind of a circle shaped. Think of like a typical jellyfish. It has kind of a circular shape to it. Everything originates from the center and works its way out, as opposed to like a human is bilateral. It has a left and a right side, as opposed to a sponge, which doesn't have any symmetry, which is why we call it irregular symmetry. The Cnidarians are mostly marine. There are some that are found in freshwater, but most of them are found in the ocean. And there's 2 general body shapes that Cnidarians can have that you'll find all of them in. One is what's known as the Medusa body form. And so that's what this jellyfish has right here. It has that Medusa body shape. And it's named after this Greek mythical figure, Medusa. Medusa was a woman that had snakes for hair, and if you looked at Medusa, it would turn you into stone. So this jellyfish obviously won't turn you into stone if you look at it, but it does have a mouth with tentacles around it, just like Medusa has a mouth with snakes around it. So that's why the Medusa shape of a Cnidarian is named after her. And so the key thing about this body form that makes it different from the other body form that we'll talk about in a minute is that it has a mouth and tentacles facing downward, and it moves around. So jellyfish swim. As opposed to this thing down here, so this is the polyp body shape. So this is a type of anemone. So this is an anemone that only comes out at night in the Caribbean. So that's places like Florida, the Bahamas, and such. And what this polyp has going on is it's got a mouth. That's what's in the middle right there. And then it's got tentacles all the way around the mouth. So just like the jellyfish, just like a Medusa has a mouth with tentacles all the way around it, so does a polyp. But the difference is that with the polyp, the mouth and the tentacles are facing up. With the Medusa, the mouth and the tentacles are facing down. And in another very important difference is you can see this anemone is attached to the seafloor. It is stuck in place. Whereas the Medusa jellyfish here, it is swimming around. So 2 main differences. One is that with the Medusa, the mouth faces down, as do the tentacles. With the anemone, the polyp, the mouth faces up along with the tentacles facing up. And one swims around and one doesn't. So that's how they're different. And this is again just showing kind of a different look at each of those. So Medusa on the top, again, mouth, this thing right here, tentacles right there facing downward, whereas on a polyp, mouth right there, tentacles facing up right there. So what makes cnidarians? What they all share in common? So this is then what a coral and a jellyfish share in common is they have these crazy features known as nematocysts. So that's how one pronounces that word. And so you might remember another type of nematocyst we talked about. That was the small little air-filled balls that some algae use. That nematocyst is pronounced the same way, but is spelled differently. And those nematocysts are used for helping an algae stay afloat, whereas these nematocysts are used for stinging things. So why jellyfish are so unpleasant to touch, or at least to touch their tentacles, is these nematocyst things that they use for protecting themselves and for feeding themselves. And how nematocysts work essentially is typically there's a little like hair at the surface of them. And if you bump into that hair, this spear-like thing that has these nasty barbs sticking out of it, they shoot out. And so if you've ever gotten stung by a jellyfish, essentially what happened is millions and millions and millions of these tiny little cells shot their tiny little spears into your skin. So that's why it's not so pleasant, because if you can imagine, having millions of tiny little hypodermic needles shot into your skin all at once, it's not a particularly pleasant sensation. And on top of that, some types of jellyfish will actually have toxins inside of these barbs. So not only do you have the sensation of it not being very pleasant to have little spears shot into you, then you can also have a toxin that might get stuck into your skin, which can be really unpleasant, or in some cases can actually even be deadly. So that's what a nematocyst is. So some more things that unite all of the various cnidarians. So they're all carnivores, right? So they're all eating other animals. They all have an incomplete digestive system. So they have a digestive system very different from ours. So with them, they have just one hole. They have a mouth, and that mouth is also their anus. It's also their butt. So essentially, they eat food through their mouth, they digest it, and then they spit it back out through their mouth that is also their butt. All of us, or at least most of us, I assume, obviously have a mouth and a butt. So we have a very different way of digesting our food from them. So we're much less disgusting than they are, with their mouth being their butt. They do have something kind of like a brain, not completely like a brain, but like a brain. They have this thing known as a nerve net that kind of goes throughout their body. And that is what they use to move around and to coordinate what they're doing. So if that was us, it would be almost as if your brain was located everywhere in your body. Instead of having a brain just in one place, it's all throughout your body. That's what they have. Some of the cnidarians that swim around can actually use that brain that's throughout their whole body in order to sense light. So some can actually see. For instance, a lot of these things we'll often see. So now we're going to talk about about a few different types of cnidarians. And the first one that we'll talk about are these things. So this crazy word is pronounced scyphozoans. So these are the scyphozoans within the class Scyphozoa. So these are what we typically call jellyfishes, or as some people call sea jellies, because they're obviously not fishes. They're not related to them very closely. So some people call them sea jellies. We can just call them jellyfishes. And how these things kind of operate is that they have a large medusa, in that will switch to smaller polyps, and then back to a large medusa, and then back to small polyps. So that they spend most of their lives in this shape, and this is what we're kind of used to seeing. But they do have small polyps as well. How these things move around is that there's a ring of muscles around the bell of this thing is called the bell. There's muscles around it, and when those muscles contract, they force water downward out through the bottom of the bell, and that pushes them forward. So it's not a particularly efficient way to swim around, and as a result, these things can't swim very quickly. So in general, jellyfish just kind of drift with whatever current happens to be around them. In general, they can't swim against strong currents. So like I was just saying, they get pushed around by water. So one really important thing to note is that jellyfish have tentacles and octopi have arms. which is why octopi sometimes get more credit than the cnidarians or than jellyfishes, even though they shouldn't get that credit because they don't even have tentacles. So Joel, year after year, gets disappointed by the fact that he doesn't win the most tentacle award. It goes to stupid. Here's the next group I want to talk about. So these are the Cubomedusae, known as the class Cubozoa. And so you might recognize the prefix here, cube, sounds like the word cube, which is a box. And so these are what are known as the box jellyfish. You see they're kind of in this box shape. And so these things, they're pretty small, as opposed to the Scyphozoans, which have large medusa. These are pretty small medusa. But even if they are small, they can oftentimes pack a punch. So a lot of box jellyfish, they have nematocysts that are so potent in toxins that they can kill humans. So these, like I said, are the box jellyfish. And like I was saying, they can kill humans. They kill as many as 100 people per year. In particular, there's something known as an Australian box jellyfish, which is obviously found in Australia. And that jellyfish has enough toxin in it to kill a couple dozen people. So each one of those tiny little jellyfish that are maybe like a couple of inches long, they can kill maybe like 30 or 40 people. Which is why when people run into them, they unless they get medical treatment really, really fast, they're in a lot of trouble. So these things are really some of the more dangerous animals in the ocean. People are oftentimes, really scared of sharks. They worry about sharks in the ocean. Nobody wants to get eaten by a shark. But actually, sharks only kill something like maybe 5 to 10 people per year, whereas these things can kill somewhere around 100 people per year. So if you go in the ocean, it should be these you're looking out for, not really for sharks. So then the last group of cnidarians that I wanted to talk about are what are known as the Anthozoans. So these are the Anthozoans, which are all in the class Anthozoa. And these include the more sessile types of cnidarians, so things that are attached to the sea floor. So we're talking about corals, we're talking about sea fans, and we're talking about anemones. And so these things, they can either be single or in a colony. I'll describe what that means in a minute. And they have polyps that lack a medusa. So what you see here, each of these things only exist in the polyp form. They're never swimming around in a sort of jellyfish shape. And so sometimes they can be single and sometimes they can be in a colony. So this, for instance, is one single polyp, right? So there's just one of it. But over in this coral is made up of many, 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 many individual polyps that are all in a colony. So that's why corals in general tend to be a lot bigger than anemones, because corals are made up of many polyps, whereas an anemone is made up of just one polyp. So these things, some of them have a hard skeleton underneath. So corals, like this thing here, there will be soft tissue on the top where all of the polyps are, but then underneath it there's going to be a hard skeleton of calcium carbonate, right? Which is part of why corals are so important, is because the hard skeleton that is underneath them is what forms the foundation for this entire reef that you see behind there. Without these corals, that whole reef doesn't exist. So this is showing a close-up of a type of coral known as Mont Astraea. This is a coral that's found in the Caribbean. And so this is showing you how there are all these different polyps here. So that's a polyp, there's a polyp, that's a polyp, that's a polyp, that's a polyp. All of these things are individual polyps. But all of these individual polyps make up one coral. So these are all a colony of polyps. And so how these polyps work is essentially if a polyp gets really big, then it kind of splits itself in half and now becomes two polyps. And because it's done that, both of those polyps have the same DNA as each other. They're like identical twins to each other. So they are essentially clones of each other, which is why we call this a colony. So think colony sounds kind of like clone. These are all individual clones of each other. So that they are a little bit separate from each other. They do have their own mouth and their digestive tracts, so that is separate, but they are connected to each other. So there's soft tissue that connects all of these things. So they're kind of individual. They have an individual mouth. They each have their own mouth and gut, but they are all connected to the same thing. So they are all essentially one animal. So that's a close-up of some polyps. Here's another one. Uh, so this is a different type of coral that's found in the Red Sea. And again, you can see the individual mouths all along here. So like there's a mouth there's a mouth, and you can see all the tentacles that are facing outward. This is what a coral reef looks like in the daytime. Very vibrant, lots and lots of things will live in coral reefs. And here's another type of, this is what's known as Staghorn Coral. So this is a coral that was really common in the Caribbean until recently, and now sadly isn't so common anymore. But you can see there's a lot of shelter inside of there, and you can't see any fish in there, but there are tons and tons of fish inside of that coral that are all hiding within it. So let's now go on to the second group I wanted to talk about, and these are the Tenafores. So they are pretty closely related to cnidarians. In fact, in the past, people used to consider them to be the same thing, and they're even called comb jellies, so they're similar to the jellyfishes of the cnidarians. But there are some really important differences between the comb jellies, which are the phylum Tenafora, and in the cnidarians we just talked about. So one important difference is that the comb jellies have these things that are called ciliary combs that run along the length of their body, right? So these little things that look like tiny little combs, those are the ciliary combs. And those things, they're like little paddles that they beat back and forth. And what they're essentially doing is pushing this thing through the water, right? By the effort of all these tiny little paddles moving, that pushes this thing through the water. So these combs are for movement. These things, like the cnidarians, have radial symmetry. So they have a central point running through their middle, and everything radiates out from that central point. So one really key difference between the comb jellyfish and the cnidarians is that comb jellies do not have nematocysts. So these things you can pick up, you can touch them, and they won't sting you. Right, so these are the much more benign version of the jellyfishes. Which is not to say that they're not dangerous to other things. So they do have tentacles that are sticky that will attach to their prey and they use them to feed on things, but they won't hurt you. And so their tentacles, I think they're kind of more like fly paper. So how if you have flies in your house, you might put hang fly paper from the ceiling. The flies run into it and get stuck. This is kind of like what the Tenafores do. They have that long, sticky tentacle that stuff gets stuck onto. And so these things are not super diverse. There's only about 100 species of them. They're only found in the ocean. But even though there's only about 100 species, they can get really, really abundant in the ocean. In fact, there's been a growing concern in the past maybe 10, 15 years that in a lot of places where there used to be lots of fish, lots of tasty fish that we've now eaten a lot of or most of or all of, in those areas where the fish are disappearing, we're now seeing more and more of these comb jellyfish. So it seems like the ocean is getting more and more gelatinous every year. That where there were once fish, now there are these comb jellies that are taking their place, which is obviously not a good thing. Because fish are tasty and comb jellies, nobody eats them. They're basically just imagine like Jello that just tastes kind of salty. That's kind of what what eating them would. So then the last group that we're going to talk about in this part of chapter 7 are the mollusks. So now we've kind of taken a jump from these things, these very simple cnidarians and Tenafores that have radial symmetry, and now we're jumping into these groups of animals that all have bilateral symmetry. So first, let's now talk about and what we're essentially going to do is we're going to answer, what does an octopus, a mussel, and a garden snail all have in common? So all of those things are types of mollusks, and so they all have some things in common because they are all related to each other. So the mollusks are maybe one of my favorite groups of invertebrates, simply because they're really huge. There's lots and lots of them, and they're super diverse, right? So there are a lot of different ways that an animal could be a mollusk. There's a lot of different body shapes that they can have, which I find to be pretty interesting. The body plan of mollusks, all of them essentially have a head, which you can see on this octopus right there. There is its head. They all have something that's known as a foot. That is typically on the bottom of a mollusk. So, for instance, with a garden snail, the thing that is on the ground that they use to move around on top of, that's their foot. In the case of an octopus, the arms are the foot. In the case of a mussel, the foot is part of what attaches it to the ground. So in general, the foot is something that is used for grabbing onto things or moving around. And all of them have a big, massive thing of internal organs. Actually not that different from us. We have a chest cavity and an abdominal cavity that have our internal organs. They have this thing that has a big mass, typically called a visceral mass, that has all of their internal organs inside. And what is covering that mass of internal organs is something known as a mantle. So the mantle is kind of an outer protective covering of that mass of internal organs. And on some mollusks, the mantle is what actually makes a hard shell. So an octopus doesn't have a hard shell, but something like a clam or a snail has a hard shell. And what actually produces that hard shell is the mantle. So some mollusks have what's known as a radula, and that is it's kind of like a paint scraper that you might use for scraping paint off a wall. And it's used for essentially scraping stuff off of surfaces. And so that's what a lot of mollusks use to eat small invertebrates off of the seafloor, or to eat small plants off the seafloor. Some things like an octopus, they don't really have a radula so much. They have something more kind of like the beak of a bird. But some mollusks have a radula anyway. So these things, unlike all the groups we've talked about until now, they do have a central nervous system that has a brain. In fact, probably a lot of you have even heard of the intelligence of octopi and some of the incredible things that they are capable of doing. And why they're able to do that is that they have a very well-developed brain. So mollusks all have brains. And they have a lot of the same organ systems that we have, actually. So they have a circulatory system so they have a heart, and they have veins and capillaries and all that stuff that they use for pumping nutrients and oxygen and carbon dioxide around their bodies. They also have a complete digestive system, meaning that they have a mouth and they have a butt. Unlike those disgusting cnidarians that we talked about a little while ago, that their mouth is their butt. The mollusks are more like us in that they have a mouth and they have a separate butt. So the mollusks, in a lot of ways, are not actually that different from us. The main difference being there that they mostly live underwater and they don't have a backbone, whereas we obviously do have a backbone, and most of us spend most of our time underwater. So we're gonna go through a few different groups of mollusks, kind of starting with kind of maybe the simpler ones, and then getting a little bit more complex. So the first one that I want to talk about, the first group I want to talk about, are what are known as the gastropods. So these are things that are in the class Gastropoda. And this includes things like snails. So there's what's known as a cone snail. It includes things like limpets. That's what this thing is right there. It includes abalones, which you can find on the west coast of the U.S. So this is a type of abalone that we find here in California. And then we have different types of sea slugs. And so what the word gastropod means, it means belly-footed. And so the gastropart, refers to the gut, like the digestive tract. If you were to go to like a gastropub, refers to a place with really good food. So gastro means stomach, or gut or something like that. And the suffix poda means foot, right? So pod means foot, kind of like a tripod is a three-legged thing used for holding up a camera. So the gastropod means belly foot. And essentially how it works is on something like this snail. So all of the internal organs are in there, and then that sits on top of the foot. Same right there with the limpet, all the internal organs are here, and that sits on top of the foot. So all these things have essentially they have their visceral mass with all of their important internal organs, and that sits on top of a foot. On a lot of these, they have a shell that's in a coil, right? So snails have a coiled shell on top. Sea slugs don't have any sort of shell. Abalone have something like a partially coiled shell. It's not a full coil, but they do have a kind of circle-shaped shell. And limpets also have a shell. So sea slugs, like I was saying a minute ago, they've completely lost their shell. You can probably guess that the shell is mostly used for defense, for keeping yourself from getting eaten. So what a lot of sea slugs do instead is they'll have these kind of spiny-like things that have venom in them, so that they're not something that you want to eat. And how most of these things eat is with their radula. So for instance, like this abalone and this limpet, how they feed is they have tiny little radula, and they kind of use that and scrape it along the sea floor. So in doing so, what they're doing is scraping tiny little invertebrates and little pieces of algae off of the sea floor. So this is it's more kind of like deposit feeding. They're eating stuff that's deposited on the sea floor. So that's how things like this limpet feed. The abalone, sorry, I think I mistook a second ago. Abalone don't scrape stuff off the seafloor. What they actually do is they're suspension feeders. So they suck in water, they filter the particles out of it, and they spit it back out. So they're filter feeders essentially, like a clam or a mussel or like a sponge for that matter. And then some of these, so like for instance, this snail is actually a carnivore. So this is what's known as a cone snail, and it actually specializes in eating fishes. So it has this thing known as a proboscis, which is kind of like its tongue. And what that tongue does is it comes out like a little spear, and that spear has toxins in it that will kill a fish really quickly. It attacks the nervous system of the fish and neutralizes it. Because fish are not that different from us in terms of their nervous system, these things can actually also be dangerous to humans. So if you ever see something, if you're ever in like Australia and you see something like this, do not pick it up because it could be a cone snail, and if it is a cone snail, then it could actually kill you. It could have a toxin in its tongue that could actually shut down your nervous system. And it's a good thing to have your nervous system running, so don't let that happen to you. The gastropods can be really pretty. Even if they might be kind of small, they can be really pretty. So this is what's known as a nudibranch. It's a type of sea slug. This little guy was maybe an inch long or so. So there's its little gills. It's got its little butt right there. Its little antenna it uses to sense the world around it, and its mouth is essentially underneath. Here's another type of nudibranch. Again, its cute little mouth and tentacles, its little gills right there, and its little butt is right underneath there. And it's got these nasty kind of things sticking out that have toxins in them that essentially advertise to predators, hey, I have these toxins, you don't want to eat me. Even though I'm not protected by a shell, I do have these things, so don't mess with me. That's what it says. Okay, the second group of mollusks that I want to talk about are the bivalves. So these are things in the class Bivalvia. And so these include mussels, it includes scallops, clams, oysters. This includes probably the tastier varieties of mollusks. And what makes a bivalve is first of all in how it feeds. So all of these things are filter feeders. So they all suck in water through what are known as siphons. They run that water over their gills, which cleans all of the food particles out of the water, and then they spit clean water back out through their siphon. So they're all filter feeders. And why we call them bivalves. So I think a lot of you will notice that it has the prefix bi, which means two valves. So that's literally all the animals that have two valves. So each one of these things, they have two shells. In these pictures, you can really only see one shell. But I think a lot of you know that each of these things will have two shells in the whole body. So the whole mantle cavity is kind of shoved between the two shells. And I think it's probably fairly obvious that the point of having those shells is for protection. It protects those soft bits that are underneath. And so I kind of mentioned this a minute ago, but how they feed is they have little siphons that they use for sucking in water. So imagine like a snorkel that you would use for breathing in air while you're snorkeling around. So they have these little siphons for sucking in water. In those siphons, then run that water over their gills. And so the gills actually, have two functions. So that they are used for respiration, so getting oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. But they're also used for filter feeding. So any small little particles of food that are in the water get trapped on the gills, and then those are then moved to the mouth with something that's known as the palps of a bivalve. So these things, they don't have a head like a squid or an octopus does, and they don't have radula. And they don't really need those things because these are all, around the seafloor. They don't move around so much or at all, and they're not scraping stuff off the seafloor. So they don't really need to have a head, and they don't need to have radula. And so where you can find these things and what you can find them doing, things like clams will burrow themselves into sand, so you pretty much only ever find them in sandy areas. Oysters and mussels will be attached to hard sea floors and attached to each other. Scallops are the only ones that kind of swim around, and swim is kind of maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. They swim kind of a little bit by opening and closing their shells and kind of forcing water out. But it's not as if they can just decide, okay, I'm going to move a couple miles away right now. It's a pretty rudimentary type of swimming. But either way, they're not attached to the seafloor or kind of living in the seafloor like. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of bivalves in the ecosystems that they are found. So they are water cleaners. As we talked about just a minute ago, they filter water through their bodies, and so they essentially clean up the water. And so this has been kind of a problem for a lot of bays and estuaries throughout the U.S. Because in a lot of areas, the number of bivalves found in those areas have gone down. So this, for instance, is a chart showing the amount of catches of bivalves, mainly oysters, in Chesapeake Bay. So Chesapeake Bay is on the east coast of the U.S. It's that bay that is between Virginia and Maryland, pretty close to like where Washington, D.C. is. And you can see that in the 1800s, up through today, there's been a steady decline in the amount of bivalves that are in the water. And the reason for that is because people catch them to eat them. So in the late 1800s, it started to become a fashionable thing to eat oysters, and so people started eating lots and lots and lots of them. Before that, oysters weren't really seen as a delicacy or as even anything to eat at all. In fact, back in the day, they used to feed oysters and lobsters to inmates. So people in prison would be fed lobsters and oysters. Can you imagine you're in jail and you're brought to the cafeteria and you see that you have a dinner of lobster and oyster, and you're like, oh my God, do I have to eat lobster and oysters again? What's with all the lobster and oyster? It's terrible. It's funny now because now those things are considered delicacies, but back in the day, those were considered like the food of prisoners and of poor people. So that's what was fed to prisoners back in the day. But now they're considered delicacies, and as a result, we see this plot where the number of oysters in estuaries has gone down a lot. Pollution hasn't been so good for them either. Certain types of pollution have really wrecked them. A lot of these bays have also been developed too, so places where there were bivalves before have now been filled in and made into, made into the cities that are around these bays. Like for instance, the whole like all of Manhattan, New York, used to be salt marsh and used to be area where there was oysters, and now it's one of the biggest cities in the U.S. So anyway, these things have been bad for these. And as a result, the role of oysters as things that can clean the water has gone down. So there's nothing filtering that water anymore, which is why there has been some efforts to restore them. So for instance, something that I did when I was in graduate school is I helped work on a project where we put oysters in different parts of New York Harbor. So like in New York Harbor, and then some of like the estuaries around like Brooklyn and Queens and in Staten Island and up into the Hudson River. We were basically looking to see if the oysters would even just grow there, if the water was clean enough for them to grow in, if it was free enough of pollution for them to grow. And we did find actually that in some places they grew quite well. Which is basically the first step. Then the second step is making places where oysters can then live in those estuaries. Because if they can live there in a cage, like cages that we were putting out, then they can presumably live on the seafloor and start helping to clean the water. Okay, so this is what's known as a giant Pacific clam, and I want to talk about this a little bit. Because these are the things that make pearls that you've probably. So this is the pearl of a giant Pacific clam, and what that pearl actually is a little piece of shell essentially. So how pearls are made is that a little piece of shell gets into the body of the clam. And it doesn't like having that little piece of sand in it, but the sand gets kind of stuck. And so what it will do is it'll start growing shell around that piece of sand. And in some cases, it'll just keep growing and growing and growing that shell around that piece of sand. So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and sometimes it can get even really huge like this. I mean, typically they're pretty small, maybe just like, at the most, maybe half an inch across. But this one was massive, right? So this one went to the market in 2016, and it weighed 75 pounds. It was by far the biggest pearl ever found. I think the biggest one up to that was maybe 20 pounds. So this one was huge, right? So think of for a second about what the value of that thing might have been. And what it was valued at was $130 million, right? So just stupid amounts of money. And so that's what, so that's what a pearl is. And so that's, I don't know if it's worth $130 million, but essentially it's just a piece of sand that a giant Pacific clam is built shell around. Okay, so the next group that I want to talk about are the cephalopods. So these are some of maybe the more interesting types of mollusks because they're the most active. So this includes the squids, it includes the octopi, it includes the cuttlefishes, it includes this thing that's known as a nautilus, and it includes a group known as the ammonites, which are actually now extinct animals, but they are the ancestor of all of these different things. So why these are called cephalopods is because the prefix cephalo means head, and poda, which we just talked about in the case of the gastropods, means foot. So they are head-footed, right? So there's the head and there's its foot. So the arms on these things is the foot. So a head and a foot is what these are made of. These things are all predatory, so they will all attack and kill their prey and eat them. How they move around is with water jet propulsion. So on a squid, for instance, on the underside of the squid is its siphon, not that different from the siphon of a bivalve. And what it will do is it'll suck in water into its mantle cavity and then shoot that water out through the siphon. So by shooting that water out in a directed way, that's going to propel the squid in whichever direction the water is being forced out. So a squid can aim its siphon, say, this way, and that'll cause the squid to move that direction. Whereas a squid can also turn its siphon around, so then water gets shot out this direction, making the squid go this way. So these things are all very fast, very agile predators. And they have a siphon and a mantle. So the mantle part is the top part. So that's the mantle. There's the mantle of this one. There's the mantle of the cuttlefish. And then the mantle is under the shell of this nautilus. And so these things are known for being very smart. So they all have a very well-developed nervous system. They have eyes that are just as complex as ours. They have a really large brain that they can use to coordinate their movements, to coordinate the movement of all their various arms and of their eyes, and to perceive the things that they see with their eyes. So they're pretty intelligent animals, especially. On the top part of their bodies, they have this mantle thing that then covers all of their organs. So inside of a squid, all of the organs are right there. Inside of an octopus, all the organs are right there. Inside of a cuttlefish, they're all up there. And inside of a nautilus, they're all underneath the shell. So these things, they have a radula, which has basically been conformed into these beak-like jaws. So the jaws of them are kind of like the beak of a bird, really. And what they use that beak to do is to either crush up prey. So like nautili, for instance, will eat like things like snails off the seafloor, and so they can use their beaks for crushing things, or they use it for ripping bits of flesh off of their prey. The shells of these things are different depending on which one you look at. So in the case of a squid and a cuttlefish, they have an internal shell. So both of these things, they have this hard piece that runs along the length of their body. So on a squid, that's along here. What's known as a pen runs along that. And then a cuttlefish has what's typically called a cuttle bone, which is along the back along there. In those things, they kind of function in the same way that our backbones function. They give them some support. An octopus doesn't have anything like that. So the only hard part of an octopus are the jaws, which is why octopi can fit through really small cracks and crevices. And then a nautilus does have a whole shell. And so when you look at a nautilus, you can kind of see that it's not that different from a snail. And that's because snails are the ancestors of all of these things. It's just on some of these they've lost that shell that they used to have in their snail ancestors. There's a picture of an octopus. So I've seen lots and lots of octopi when I've been scuba diving, mostly at night because they tend to be more night predators. And sometimes I've been lucky enough to see some that are really, really active. Like this one was moving around on the reef, feeding and hunting for its prey. So octopi are definitely fun animals to. So let's talk a little bit about the intelligence of those octopi. So octopi are capable of something known as social learning. So social, you can guess, has something to do with like society, something to do with other individuals. It essentially is being able to learn by looking at other things doing something. So for instance, we can kind of learn how to do tasks by watching others do it. The way that you start to learn how to drive a car is by watching somebody else do it. It's the same with octopi. Not that they can drive cars, but they can watch other octopi do things like solve puzzles inside of aquaria and learn how to do those puzzles by watching their fellow octopi. So that's one kind of cool thing that they can do. They're also known for using tools. So there is something known as a coconut octopus. And what coconut octopi do is they will gather coconut shells on the seafloor and put them together. So they'll get like two pieces of coconut shells, put them together, and that makes one whole home for them. So they will find these things, bring them together, and use them as a home. So this is a little bit different from, say, a hermit crab. So hermit crabs, they use their home, they use their shell their whole lives, whereas an octopus will assemble the pieces of their home and they'll sometimes use it and sometimes they won't use it. So that's why we call this tool use, because it's something that's not used all the time, whereas the hermit crab uses its shell all the time. And something that cephalopods are also known for is their uncanny ability to predict World Cup games. So World Cup, football, or what we call soccer games. So this is what's known as Paul the Octopus. And in the 2010 World Cup, he successfully predicted 11 of 13 games that his owner had him predict. So essentially what he did is he would take two flags, Spain and Germany. He would have a clam in each of those crabs. A clam in each of these boxes that you see there. And whichever clam Paul went and ate was his prediction. And so we got 11 out of 13 right, which is pretty good. That's typically a lot better than I can do in predicting World Cup games. Okay, of course, I'm gonna make a cuddle joke because cuttlefish, do like to cuddle. Well, not really. They're just called cuttlefish. Okay, last group that I wanted to talk about are the chitons. So they have this crazy word here. So they are called the class Polyplacophora. So let's break that word down. So poly, I think a lot of you know, means many. So like a polygon is a multiple-sided shape. Plaque, think of like plaque on your teeth, right? So it's like a hard plate on your teeth. So plaque means plate, and fora means to bear, to have something. Like we talked about how the periphera, like the pore part, means holes, and fora means to bear. So periphera are hole-bearing animals. So these are the multiple plate-bearing animals. So if you look on this chiton, you see all of these different things here. Those are the hard plates of a chiton. So it has multiple hard plates on its back. So it has multiple hard plates. That's why we call it Polyplacophora. So they have a foot underneath. That's like this striped thing that you see there. So they have this foot on the ground. They have a mouth with a radula they use for grazing on things that are on the seafloor. So scraping seaweeds and invertebrates off of the seafloor underneath them. And that's all I've got to tell you about the cnidarians, about the Tenafores, and about the mollusks. So in the next lesson, we'll learn about some other different types of invertebrates.